The year was 1934, and the most powerful Italian crime boss in New York City was asking for a meeting with a black man from Harlem. This alone was remarkable enough to stop conversation in every back room and private club from the Bronx to Brooklyn. Not because meetings between the Italian families and black operators were unheard of. They happened. They were necessary. A practical acknowledgement that certain neighborhoods and certain operations existed in spaces that the formal structure of the five families could not fully control without the cooperation of the men who had built those spaces from the ground up. But those meetings happened on specific terms, within a specific hierarchy, with a specific and well understood understanding of who was doing the asking and who was doing the accommodating. What made this meeting different was the direction. Lucky Luciano was not asking Bumpy Johnson to come and discuss terms. He was asking him to come as an equal. He used that word explicitly in the message he sent through the intermediary who had been chosen specifically because he was trusted by both men, equal. A word that, in the world both men operated in 1934 in New York City, carried an enormous amount of weight precisely because it was so rarely used across the particular line that separated them. Bumpy Johnson was 29 years old. He had been in Harlem for 4 years. He had survived the specific gauntlet of establishing himself in one of the most competitive criminal environments in America, with a combination of intelligence, patience, and a capacity for violence that he deployed sparingly but unmistakably when the situation required it. He was not yet what he would become, but he was already, unmistakably, something. The men who had tried to test him in those first years had learned this. The men who had tried to dismiss him had learned this in a different way. Lucky Luciano was 40 years old, or close to it, and was at the peak of a power that had been built on a combination of organizational genius and ruthlessness that the American criminal underworld had not seen before and would not see again in quite the same form. He had reorganized the structure of Italian organized crime in New York in a way that was, by any measure, a work of strategic brilliance, replacing the old mustache-Pete hierarchy with something more efficient, more durable, more capable of surviving the inevitable pressures that law enforcement and internal competition would bring to bear on it. He had done this by being smarter than everyone around him and by being willing, when intelligence alone was insufficient, to be more decisive. He was also, which was not unrelated to his success, a genuinely perceptive reader of other people. He had the specific quality of attention that distinguishes the truly dangerous from the merely powerful, the ability to see what a person actually was rather than what they presented, to identify the real substance underneath the performance. And what he saw when he looked at the reports his people had been compiling on Ellsworth Johnson of Harlem was something that he did not see often and that he had learned over a long career of watching powerful men rise and fall, to treat with a specific kind of respect. He saw someone who could not be bought and could not be frightened and could not be out-hawked by the conventional methods available to men who relied primarily on money and violence to maintain their position. He saw someone who was, in the specific terms that mattered most to Luciano, a genuine peer, not in power, not yet, but in kind, in the specific quality of mind and character that produced durable power rather than temporary advantage. This was not a comfortable recognition for a man in Luciano's position. Comfortable recognitions are easy to act on. Uncomfortable ones require something more. They require the specific kind of intellectual honesty that allows a powerful man to look at someone outside his own circle, outside his own background and ethnicity and the hierarchy he has built and benefits from, and acknowledge that what he sees is real, regardless of how inconvenient the acknowledgement is. Luciano was capable of this. It was one of the things that made him what he was. The meeting took place in a private room above an Italian restaurant in Lower Manhattan, a room that had hosted significant conversations before, but none quite like this one. Luciano brought 2 men with him. Bumpy brought 1. This asymmetry was deliberate on both sides, and was understood by both sides to be a signal, rather than a statement of relative power. Luciano signaling that this was not an ambush, Bumpy signaling that he was not afraid. They sat across from each other at a table that had been cleared of everything except glasses and a bottle of whiskey. Neither man had eaten, though food had been offered. Food suggested a social occasion. This was a business conversation, and both men understood that framing it correctly from the beginning was important. Luciano poured. He poured for Bumpy first, which was a small thing that Bumpy noticed and filed. Small things told you more than large ones in rooms like this. "You know why you're here," Luciano said. It was not a question. "I have some ideas," Bumpy said. Luciano almost smiled. "Almost. You're more careful than your reputation suggests." "My reputation is designed to encourage that assumption," Bumpy said. This time, Luciano did smile, a small, genuine expression that lasted perhaps 2 seconds before it was replaced by the focused attention of a man getting to the point. "Harlem," Luciano said. "Harlem," Bumpy agreed. The problem, as both men understood it, was this. The numbers racket in Harlem was, by 1934, one of the most profitable illegal operations in New York City. The scale of it, the volume of small bets placed daily by a population that had limited access to other forms of economic participation and that had developed, over years, a genuine cultural relationship with the numbers game, produced a cash flow that was, on any given week, substantial enough to matter to organizations operating at the level that both Luciano and Bumpy Johnson operated at. The Italian families had controlled the Harlem numbers racket for years before Bumpy arrived. They had controlled it the way they controlled most things, through a combination of violence and structural advantage, through the specific leverage that came from being connected to the larger apparatus of organized crime in a way that black operators simply were not. This had worked. For a time, what had changed was Bumpy Johnson. Bumpy had not arrived in Harlem and immediately challenged the existing structure. That was not how he operated, and it was not, in any case, the strategically intelligent approach given the disparity in resources and connections in 1930. What he had done, instead, was spend 2 years learning the neighborhood, the people, the specific texture of the relationships that constituted Harlem's community life. Learning who trusted whom and who owed whom, and what the actual leverage points were in a community that had developed its own internal economy precisely because the external economy had systematically excluded it. He had also spent those 2 years building, not building in the obvious way, not assembling soldiers and claiming corners, building the kind of infrastructure that produces durable power rather than temporary advantage. He had built loyalty, the specific loyalty of people who believed that the man they were following actually cared about what happened to them. He had built information networks, the cleaning staff and the maintenance crews, and the invisible people who moved through every space, and were never suspected of listening. He had built relationships with the community institutions, the churches and the small businesses and the mutual aid societies, the organizations that constituted the real connective tissue of Harlem's social fabric. By 1932, he had begun to move, not against the Italian operations directly. Around them, he had begun operating the numbers in specific blocks and specific buildings where his community relationships gave him an advantage that the Italian operators, who had always seen Harlem as a resource to be extracted rather than a place to be invested in, simply could not replicate. He had begun, quietly and steadily, to take market share, not through violence, primarily, though he had demonstrated on enough occasions that violence was available when necessary to establish that this was not a soft operation, through the specific advantage of being genuinely of the community rather than being a foreign power extracting from it. By 1934, the Italian families had a problem. They were losing ground in Harlem, not catastrophically, but steadily, in the specific way that steady losses are more threatening than sudden ones. Because sudden losses can be responded to and steady ones change the underlying landscape before anyone realizes the landscape has changed. Luciano had looked at this problem with the same analytical clarity he brought to every problem. He had considered the obvious responses, the responses that other men in his position had tried. Direct confrontation, the application of sufficient violence to re-establish the hierarchy that Bumpy's quiet expansion had disrupted. He had looked at this option carefully and had reached a conclusion that his subordinates had found surprising when he shared it. The violence option would not work. Not against this particular operator. Not because Bumpy was immune to violence. Nobody is immune to violence. But because the specific thing that Bumpy had built in Harlem, the loyalty and the community connection and the genuine integration with the social fabric of the neighborhood, was not something that violence could displace. You could hurt the man. You could not hurt what the man represented to the community. And if you tried, you would create a martyr and a cause and a level of community resistance that would make your position in Harlem significantly worse than it currently was. This was not an analysis that was comfortable to arrive at. It required acknowledging that a black operator in Harlem had built something that the Italian families, with all their resources and connections and decades of structural advantage, could not simply overwrite. Luciano arrived at it anyway, because his commitment to accuracy exceeded his commitment to comfort. The second option he considered was what he described in private conversations as the accommodation model. You acknowledged the reality of what existed. You found a way to work with it rather than against it. You converted a competitor into a partner. This was not a new idea in organized crime. The entire structure of the commission, which Luciano had been instrumental in creating, was built on accommodation, on the recognition that competition between powerful operators produced costs that cooperation could eliminate. What was new, or at least unusual, was applying this model across the specific line that Luciano was now considering crossing. The meeting above the Italian restaurant was the result of Luciano's decision that the accommodation model was the correct one, and that the accommodation needed to be genuine rather than nominal, needed to be offered on terms that Bumpy Johnson would actually accept, which meant it needed to be offered on terms of actual equality rather than the kind of nominal partnership that was really just a more sophisticated form of control. "Here is what I am proposing," Luciano said, after they had been talking for 40 minutes and had covered enough ground that both men understood where they stood. "You run Harlem, the numbers, the policy operations, everything that exists in that specific geography. My families don't interfere, don't compete, don't apply pressure. You operate as an independent." He paused. "In exchange, you pay a percentage. A real percentage, not a tribute, not protection money. A partnership percentage. And you keep the peace. You keep what you control stable enough that it doesn't create problems that come back on both of us." Bumpy listened to this without expression. When Luciano finished, he was quiet for a moment. "What percentage?" he said. It was not a question about whether to accept It was the beginning of the negotiation. What followed was 90 minutes of the most careful and precise negotiation that either man had conducted in years. Not because the specific numbers were so difficult to arrive at, though they were not easy, but because both men understood that what they were actually negotiating was not a percentage. They were negotiating a relationship, a framework, a way of existing in proximity to each other that would either produce stability or produce conflict, and that both men understood would be determined not by the specific terms written down, but by the spirit in which those terms were understood and applied. Luciano wanted something he could rely on. He wanted Harlem to be a stable part of his landscape, generating its contribution reliably, not requiring the constant expenditure of resources and attention that competition required. He wanted to convert an ongoing cost into a reliable asset. Bumpy wanted something different. He wanted autonomy. He wanted the freedom to run his operations without the constant overhead of managing the Italian family's interference or the constant threat of having what he had built simply taken by men who had more conventional leverage than he did. He wanted, in other words, exactly what Luciano was offering, but he wanted to be certain that the offering was genuine, that the independence was real, that the percentage was a price paid for something, not a tribute extracted by the application of force, which would have been a different thing entirely even if the number was identical. They reached an agreement. The percentage was real, specific, written down in the form that both men trusted, which was not paper but the kind of mutual understanding that exists between people who both know that paper means nothing without the underlying reality. The independence was real. Luciano's family would not operate in Harlem's core territory, would not compete for the numbers, would not apply pressure to Bumpy's people or his operations. In exchange, Bumpy would pay the agreed percentage with the same reliability he brought to everything he did, would maintain order in his territory in the way that any partner is expected to maintain order, would bring disputes to the table rather than resolving them unilaterally when those disputes had implications that extended beyond Harlem's borders. When they shook hands at the end of the evening, both men understood that what had just happened was not primarily a business transaction. It was a recognition. Luciano was recognizing that Bumpy Johnson was real, was legitimate in the only sense that mattered in their world, was someone who had to be dealt with as an equal because the alternative was to deal with him as an enemy. And Luciano had concluded, correctly, that Bumpy Johnson as an enemy was a problem he did not need. Bumpy was recognizing something different but related. He was recognizing that Luciano was, whatever else he was, a man of his word in the specific sense that word meant in the world they both operated in, that the framework being offered was genuine, that accepting it was not a surrender but a strategic choice, the choice of a man who understood that independence maintained within a framework of mutual respect was more durable and more complete than independence achieved through constant conflict. Both recognitions were correct. The framework they built that evening lasted for years. It survived Luciano's imprisonment in 1936, when the structure of his relationships became the responsibility of his successors, and Bumpy had to navigate the specific uncertainty of whether those successors would honor commitments made by a man who was no longer in a position to enforce them personally. It survived Bumpy's own imprisonment, when the operations he had built had to continue running without his direct oversight, and when the men who ran them had to maintain the specific relationships that kept Harlem stable without the presence of the man who had created those relationships. What it did not survive, ultimately, was time and the specific kind of change that time produces. The world of the 1950s was different from the world of the 1930s in ways that neither man sitting above that Italian restaurant in 1934, could have fully anticipated. The heroin epidemic changed the calculations. The specific moral clarity that Bumpy had always maintained about certain kinds of operations. The clarity that had made him trusted in Harlem in a way that distinguished him from other operators, became harder to maintain as the economics of the underworld shifted toward the narcotics trade and as the pressure from younger operators, who had no investment in the framework built in 1934, increased. But even in its decline, even in the specific pressures that the later years brought, the framework that Bumpy Johnson and Lucky Luciano built in that private room in Lower Manhattan remained a reference point, a thing that both communities pointed to when they needed to point to something that had worked. An example of what was possible when two men, each the most significant figure in his particular world, looked at each other across every line that was supposed to make looking impossible and chose to see what was actually there. Lucky Luciano died in Naples in 1962, having been deported from the United States in 1946 after his release from prison, never permitted to return to the country he had done so much to shape. Bumpy Johnson died in Harlem in 1968, at a table in a restaurant he frequented, from a heart attack that took him without warning and without the kind of prolonged diminishment that many men in his position experienced before the end. They never met again after 1946, when Luciano left the country. But in the decades between their meeting and their deaths, both men operated within the understanding they had built in 1934 with a consistency that neither had reason to regret. The percentage was paid. The independence was maintained. The peace held, more or less, through years that tested it in ways that neither man had anticipated, but that both had, in their different ways, built structures capable of surviving. The deal changed Harlem in ways that are difficult to fully measure. What it did, most immediately, was stabilize a period that might otherwise have been extraordinarily violent. The specific contest between Bumpy Johnson's operation and the Italian families, if it had been resolved through the direct application of force rather than through negotiation, would have cost lives on both sides and would have damaged the community fabric of Harlem in ways that might have taken decades to repair. The negotiation prevented this. The framework it produced gave Bumpy Johnson the operational stability he needed to build the community infrastructure, the rent payments and the school supplies and the protection of the neighborhood's most vulnerable people. That would become the other part of his legacy. What it changed more subtly and more lastingly was the framework within which certain conversations became possible. Before 1934, the idea that a black operator in Harlem could sit across from the head of the largest criminal organization in New York and negotiate as an equal was, within the specific culture of organized crime in America, not a real idea. It existed as an aspiration, perhaps, in the minds of people who believed that such a thing should be possible. But as a practical reality, it had not happened. After 1934, it had happened once, and things that have happened once are different from things that have never happened. They exist in the realm of the possible. They can be pointed to. They can be aspired to and built toward and argued from. They constitute a precedent, even when, especially when, they are kept private rather than announced, known to the specific community of people for whom they matter rather than to the general public for whom they would mean something different. Old men in Harlem, in the years that followed, told a specific story about Bumpy Johnson. The story was not about the confrontations or the imprisonments or the specific operations that had made him famous in the way that organized crime figures become famous. It was about what he represented, about the specific claim he had made and sustained and built and defended in a world that had not been designed to allow it, about the dignity of it. The particular American dignity of a man who had decided what he was worth and had made the world, or at least the relevant portion of the world, agree. The deal with Luciano was part of that story. Not the whole of it, not even the most important part, but a part. The specific moment in which the world that had been designed to exclude him looked at what he had built and what he was, and decided that excluding him was no longer the rational choice. That is, in the end, a different kind of victory than the ones that get written about, quieter, less dramatic, but more durable. And Harlem, which understands the difference between those two kinds of victory better than almost anywhere else in America, remembered it accordingly. To understand the full weight of what happened in that room above the Italian restaurant in 1934, you have to understand what the years immediately before it had looked like. Because the deal didn't emerge from nowhere. It emerged from a specific history, a history of pressure and resistance and the gradual, costly recognition by the Italian families that what they were dealing with in Harlem was something that their standard methods could not resolve. The pressure had begun in earnest in 1931. Before that, the Italian families had treated Harlem as a straightforward extraction operation. They ran the numbers, they collected the proceeds, and the specific texture of the community they were extracting from was not their concern. This was the model that had worked in other neighborhoods. It was the model that had worked in Harlem before Bumpy Johnson arrived. The difference was this: in other neighborhoods, the communities being extracted from did not have, within their own social fabric, an operator of Bumpy Johnson's specific combination of capabilities. Someone who understood both the street-level mechanics of criminal enterprise and the deeper architecture of community loyalty. Someone who could build a competing operation not by fighting the existing one directly, but by offering something the existing one had never offered. Genuine investment in the community that was simultaneously its market and its operating environment. A man named Stephanie St. Clair, who had run the Harlem numbers before the Italian families muscled in, had tried to fight them directly and had largely failed. Not because she wasn't capable or intelligent, she was both, but because direct confrontation with the structural advantages the Italian families possessed was not a winnable strategy for a single operator without comparable backing. What she had demonstrated, through years of resistance, was that the Italian grip on Harlem was not uncontestable. She had shown that the community could be organized around an alternative. She had not been able to sustain it. Bumpy arrived at this situation with a different approach. He studied what St. Clair had done, studied where it had succeeded and where it had broken down, and he built on the successes while designing around the failures. He understood that the fundamental problem with direct confrontation was that it played to the Italian family's structural strengths. They had more money, more soldiers, more connections to the broader apparatus of power in New York. On those dimensions, a direct contest would always favor them. But there were dimensions on which the contest was not so clearly favored. Community trust was one. The specific, accumulated loyalty that came from a long history of actual investment in a neighborhood's people and institutions was not something you could buy or import. It had to be built, over time, through the kind of consistent behavior that demonstrated genuine care rather than the performance of it. Bumpy built it. He paid rent for families who couldn't make it. He funded the church programs and the school supplies. He intervened when the police got too rough, not through direct confrontation, but through the specific application of leverage that his connections allowed him to apply. He made himself, gradually and deliberately, into someone the community of Harlem needed in a way that went beyond anything the Italian operation could replicate. The Italian families noticed this. It was not something you could fail to notice if you were paying attention. And the people running the Harlem operation were paying attention because the numbers were telling them something was changing. The take from certain blocks was down. The take from certain buildings was down. The sources of this decline were not mysterious. People were placing their bets with someone else, with the man who paid their rent when they were behind, whose people didn't rough them up when they were slow to pay, who was of them rather than being a foreign power extracting from them. Several attempts were made to address this through the conventional means. Bumpy's collectors were beaten. His operations were disrupted. Men were sent to deliver the message that Harlem's numbers were not available for competition. These attempts produced results that were the opposite of what was intended. They produced a community that was more unified behind Bumpy Johnson rather than less. They produced a man who responded to each escalation with the calm, strategic patience that was his defining characteristic, absorbing the immediate cost and converting it into something more durable. He used each incident to deepen the loyalty that the incident was designed to break. He used each demonstration of Italian violence as evidence of exactly the argument he had been making to the community all along. That what the Italian families were doing in Harlem was not a business arrangement but an occupation, and that the difference mattered. By 1933, the men in charge of the Italian operation in Harlem were reporting upward that the situation had become significantly more complicated than it had previously been, that the Bumpy Johnson problem was not responding to the standard approaches, that something different was going to be required. This was the report that reached Luciano, and Luciano, who processed reports differently than most men in his position because he was genuinely interested in understanding rather than simply managing, spent several weeks thinking about it before he arrived at the conclusion that produced the meeting of 1934. The conclusion was this: what Bumpy Johnson had built in Harlem could not be taken by force without costs that exceeded the value of the taking. The community infrastructure he had created, the loyalty he had cultivated, the specific positioning of himself as a community protector against external extraction, meant that violence against him would produce a community response that would make the Italian position in Harlem worse rather than better. You could remove the man. You could not remove what the man had made himself into. The further conclusion, which was harder and which required the specific kind of intellectual honesty that made Luciano unusual among his peers, was that this situation existed because Bumpy Johnson was genuinely exceptional, not just competent, not just lucky, not just the beneficiary of specific circumstances, genuinely exceptional in the specific ways that produced durable power. And genuinely exceptional people, in Luciano's understanding of the world, were not to be destroyed if they could be aligned. They were to be recognized and dealt with accordingly. The meeting was called. This negotiation was different because both men had arrived at a similar conclusion about the leverage situation. Luciano had concluded that his leverage over Bumpy, while real role, was less absolute than it would normally be in a negotiation between a man in his position and an operator in Bumpy's position. The community infrastructure, the specific nature of what Bumpy had built, meant that the conventional leverage tools were blunted. You could threaten a man with violence, but the threat only works if the man has more to lose than to gain from resisting it. And Bumpy, who had built his position precisely on the foundation of being willing to absorb costs that other men could not absorb, was not easily threatened. Bumpy had concluded, for his part, that his leverage over Luciano was also limited. He was not in a position to inflict costs on the Italian families that they could not sustain. His power in Harlem was genuine but local. Luciano's power extended far beyond Harlem. and the resources he could bring to bear on any sustained conflict were greater than Bumpy could match. Both men had, in other words, arrived at the meeting with a clear-eyed understanding of their own limitations. This was unusual. It was also, as both men understood, exactly the foundation on which a genuine agreement could be built. Agreements built on misrepresentations of leverage are fragile. Agreements built on accurate mutual assessment of what each party can and cannot do tend to be more durable. But a relationship, the specific kind of working relationship that produces reliable outcomes over time because both parties understand what the other party actually is and what they actually will and will not do. Bumpy would later describe this understanding in one of the very few direct accounts he gave of the 1934 meeting in terms that were characteristically precise. "He knew what I was," Bumpy said, "and I knew what he was, and we both knew that knowing what the other person was, actually knowing it rather than just guessing, was the only thing that made any arrangement worth making." He paused in the telling of this and then added, in a tone that was neither warm nor cold but simply accurate, "That's rarer than you'd think. Most men don't actually know what the person they're dealing with is. They know what they want them to be, or what they're afraid they are. Luciano knew what I was. That was the thing." The arrangement that emerged from the 1934 meeting shaped the landscape of New York. Organized crime for the better part of 2 decades. It was not a perfect arrangement. No arrangement between powerful men operating in inherently unstable environments is perfect. There were periods of friction, moments when the framework was tested by events neither man had anticipated. Years when maintaining the agreement required more active management than either had hoped would be necessary. The first major test came in 1936, when Luciano was convicted on charges of compulsory prostitution and sentenced to 30 to 50 years in prison. The conviction did not destroy the organization he had built, largely because the organization had been built with the specific resilience that came from not being entirely dependent on any single person, including its creator. But it did create uncertainty about whether the commitments Luciano had made would be honored by the men who now ran his operations in his absence. Bumpy handled this uncertainty with the patience that characterized everything he did. He did not immediately attempt to renegotiate or test the new situation by expanding aggressively into territory that the agreement had designated as but it did create uncertainty about whether the commitments Luciano had made would be honored by the men who now ran his operations in his absence. Bumpy handled this uncertainty with the patience that characterized everything he did. He did not immediately attempt to renegotiate or test the new situation by expanding aggressively into territory that the agreement had designated as He waited. He continued operating within the framework as he understood it. He paid the agreed percentage on schedule without interruption, and he watched to see how the men who had taken over Luciano's operations would respond to this demonstration of continued good faith. They responded well, not because they were particularly principled or because they had a high regard for agreements made by their imprisoned predecessor. They responded well because Bumpy's continued compliance with the agreement demonstrated something that the pragmatists who now ran the Italian operations could see clearly, that this arrangement was working, that the Harlem operation was generating its contribution reliably, that the alternative, returning to the direct competition that had preceded the agreement, would cost more than the agreement cost. This was the thing that made the 1934 framework durable beyond Luciano himself. It had been built on genuine mutual interest rather than on the personal relationship between 2 specific men. The personal relationship had been the mechanism for creating it. The mutual interest was what sustained it. Bumpy himself went to prison in 1937 on federal charges related to his narcotics operations, and spent time in various federal facilities over the following decade, with periods of release punctuated by returns to custody. During these years, the operation in Harlem continued under the supervision of the people he had trained and trusted, and the framework with the Italian families continued to hold, maintained by the same logic of mutual interest that had always sustained it. When he was released and returned to Harlem, there was always the question of whether the specific relationships that had held during his absence would need to be renegotiated or would simply resume. They always resumed, because the framework was not primarily about personalities. It was about a recognition of how things actually were, a recognition that both sides found more comfortable to work within than to contest. The years between 1945 and the early 1960s were the period in which the framework faced its most sustained tests, not from the Italian families directly, but from the broader changes in the criminal landscape that neither the 1934 agreement nor anything else could fully anticipate. The heroin epidemic changed the economics of organized crime in ways that put pressure on every established arrangement. The specific moral line that Bumpy had always maintained, his refusal to allow heroin to flow through the Harlem community that had trusted and supported him, became increasingly difficult to hold as younger operators who had no investment in his ethical framework and no loyalty to the agreements he had made pushed against it from every direction. This was the specific tragedy of the later years. Not that the framework with the Italian families failed, but that the world around the framework changed in ways that the framework had not been designed to accommodate. The deal that changed Harlem was made in 1934, in a world that still had the specific shape that two men of extraordinary intelligence and pragmatism could negotiate within. By the 1960s, the shape of the world had changed enough that what had been possible in 1934 was harder to maintain. What did not change, through all of it, was the specific historical fact of the meeting and its results. The fact that Bumpy Johnson and Lucky Luciano had sat across from each other in 1934 and had seen each other accurately and had built something durable on the foundation of that accuracy. This remained true through everything that came after. It remained part of the story that Harlem told about itself, part of the evidence that the community pointed to when it needed to point to something that demonstrated what it was capable of producing. 2 men, 1 table, 90 minutes, and Harlem, for better and for worse and through all the complexity that followed, was never quite the same. The deal was made in a room above a restaurant that no longer exists, in a city that has changed almost beyond recognition since 1934, between 2 men who are both dead and who left legacies that continue to be debated and interpreted and argued over by people who never met either of them. What is not debated by anyone who looks at the evidence carefully is the fundamental nature of what they built, an arrangement between equals, in 1934, in New York, across every line that the world of that time said made equality impossible. It happened, it lasted, it mattered, and Harlem still knows it.